the Pentagon starts as a math problem. Congress authorizes so much money for each military service, and they give us a number, an aggregate number for how many people we can have in uniform. And so with that guidance, what we do is we take and determine how many young soldiers we need, how many mid-grade NCOs, how many lieutenants, how many captains, and how many majors all the way up, and basically how we can afford. Some of the challenges are, for the military, only 1 out of every 3 citizens even qualify to come in the Army for moral issues, physical issues, and things like that. So when you're dealing with a third of the population, you have to be very specific about how you bring those people in. In terms of retention, the Army, every soldier the Army retains, every officer the Army retains, is 1 fewer that we need to bring in on the front side of as they come into the military. When you think about training 120 to 130,000 people, it's a very expensive proposition. So recruiting them, assessing them, getting through training, getting them a common understanding for what they'll do in the uniform is a very expensive proposition. So keeping an experienced non-commissioned officer ensures those soldiers who are coming in have the proper leadership so they'll advance during their time in the uniform. And whether they stay for 4 or 40 years, they have every opportunity to be part of the greatest premier leadership experience we have in our country, and I submit the world, in the military. And there's so many crossovers between the military and the civilian.
And this is the part that I think is really interesting with the military and how we look at it, because as Tom walks you through that, what you see is there's programs above, there's a plan, there's organizational structure, and there's headcount. What's interesting though is oftentimes we look at our leaders and we ask them to lead their folks in a way that makes them stay. But often we don't talk about how that tactical level leader and the strategic structures in place are connected. There's a lot behind the curtain that goes into it. There's a lot of budget and a lot of funding that leaders down at the tactical level are able to leverage. That does 2 things. It builds the mission capability and makes sure that the people have everything they need, not only to conduct their mission, but to enable them to stay.
And the highest cost in the military, just like in the civilian world, is people. And all leadership and all those things you do related to that will determine whether or not the people stay. What starts as a math problem at the Pentagon becomes a human problem at the basic level of leadership. So strategic level, math problem, how many can we do, what we're authorized, operational level, how do we employ it, and then at the tactical level, how does that first line leader deal with that soldier and that family to make sure that they know that they're value added. An example, there's X amount of money in the budget, just like in your family budget or your company bottom line. And so you have to make priorities and certain decisions. So a few years back, we had X amount of money for our great special operation forces in the Army, and they'd come in for requests for additional funds. And I sat down with my counterparts in the special operations community and said, I can't give you any more, but there's probably smarter ways to apply the funds that we have. So we rolled our sleeves up, and with the same amount of money we had, we were able to tier and target the money to make sure that the right leaders were staying in to give our Army and our nation the desired effects of that great community without adding any more money. Because we, just like you, had responsibilities to the taxpayers, you have responsibilities to all your stakeholders out there to make sure that every dollar that you have is spent well.
One of the things I think is interesting about this is the difference between incentives and versus bonus. So as we work with many companies, we see there's compensation, a big piece of that is bonus structure. The part that Tom's actually talking about is incentives. What incentivizes somebody to stay when they have a critical skill that's needed? Really interesting to watch how the military puts budget behind the retention of critical skills and people in order for the purpose of retention.
Another example within the Army, we realized as we developed our cyber forces, there would be a period when their re-enlistment or their enlistment time was up that they would be incredibly marketable and could drive a high salary from an organization outside of uniform. And so what we did is we had a very deliberate approach. We started actually giving them a bonus while they were still in the Army. So their takeaway is you're valued. And so when it came time to a decision, do I stay or do I go someplace else? More often than not, they opted to stay, and we were able to build a capability for our military and for our nation.
Yeah, the piece that I think about that's fascinating is many companies describe themselves as being in a knife fight for talent or in a talent war. And the military has been too, but they put structure behind it. this is the big takeaway that I take from you, Tom, is that the structure from the strategic level through the operational level down to the tactical level is really what makes a difference. It gives, at the top of the organization, they look at different levers that can pull to incentivize people for retention, and then how that's used at the tactical level is very, person to person in a way that makes them want to stay. So when I was a young guy at SEAL Team 4, I deployed a lot down into South and Central America. And one of the sayings that I heard down there was a saying. It said, "Vale la pena." Now, "Vale la pena" translates as "worth the pain." And so what I think is interesting is that a lot of times talk about the hardships of military life, and they are hard, but every career has its hardships. What allows people to stay is when it's "vale la pena," when it is worth the pain. The point is with the structures that Tom's talking about that the military has put in place, those are incentives that are put in there to make it worth the experience, worth the pain. I think this is a lesson that could be used out in the street in everyday companies. As people look at different ways to retain, oftentimes they look at comp, and that's an obvious choice, and it's an important one to think through. But I think there are intangibles. There's recognition. There's all the softer aspects of leadership. I think the thing that's very hard is individual leaders know this, but how do you attach that to a program? How do you make that programmatic to work for your whole enterprise rather than one particular leader? How is it that what somebody experienced in one function is similar to the experience of somebody in another function, and that there is rhyme and reason, and it does make sense to people as they're looking up the organization at the different things that are available to them?
And Brendan, you make a really good point in that financial considerations. One, money motivates a lot of people in different ways, but there are other things that you can do. Some of them involve money, and I'll give you an example. We ran a program in the Army called the Strategic Leadership Seminar that brought non-commissioned officers and officers together to various places, about 14 places around the world, for an out-of-box experience in terms of leadership and thinking of problems a little bit differently. One of them was run at the University of Louisville, and I was stationed in Kentucky at the time, and I met with the fellows. And one year when I met with them, two of them told me that they were getting out of the Army months after the program, and were kind of surprised they got picked for the program. And to be honest, as a guy who ran the program, who selected them, I was interested as how we picked somebody who had intentions to get out. And after a 2-week seminar that cost the Army about $5,000 to $10,000, both of them came up to me at the conclusion, at the graduation, and said, "I've completely changed my mind. This shows me that the Army is investing in me, and they believe in me, and they see a pathway to the future." So for that $5,000 to $10,000, which we didn't give them in cash, we gave them an experience. They realized that this is something they wanted to continue to do, and that avoided me going out and recruiting, assessing, and bringing in somebody else at the tune of well over $100,000, much more for somebody in the special operations community.
Yeah, one of the things that I see in your story is that people come into the military, they come in very young. People who come into companies, they also come in very young. And what happens to them between the end of their career and the beginning is life. And as they go through life, they, perhaps they start a family. And all of these things tug on their time, they tug on their intention, they tug on them as people, and therefore it tugs on retention. And so one of the things that I think is interesting is mid-level career people in the military, usually right around between year 8 and 10, there's some life decisions that happen for most people. And when they do, what makes them stay? And so it's fascinating though, because we started off with bonus and incentive structures and pay. And then one of the things in a military life is it's not just hard for the service member, it's hard for their whole family. I would argue that their career is hard for a whole family. It takes a whole family. And what I think is interesting is in the military, there's a program called the Family Readiness Group. And so what they do is they focus not just necessarily on the service member and his readiness to be employed in his job or deploy overseas. What they're doing is looking at the entire family's readiness. And I think the interesting thing about that is that's not just at the command that I was at. That's not just in the Navy. That's also in the Army. It's in the Air Force. It's in the Marine Corps. That is one of these strategic programs that has funding to make sure they make a difference at the tactical edge. And then when you think about retention and you think of your management team, it's really important that you have continuity in your management team. Sometimes you want new people to come in, and sometimes you want to make sure that you bring, you manage your culture because somebody knows the whole organization. You need a mix of both, but to have both, you have to retain. And so I think that a lot of focus is placed on retention of the individual with tangible things like pay. And there's a lot of things that go into the decisions somebody makes about their career, whether they stay, whether they go. And oftentimes that has to do with those people who are standing behind them, supporting them and their family. I see a lot of companies have family days, they have barbecues. They do pay it attention, but the real question is it a system? Is it a means that takes something from the strategic level, brings it to the tactical level, and makes sure it's worth the pain for the person to stay? And I think that's an important point when it comes to retention.
I think one of the points or messages or takeaways are getting to know your people. A wise non-commissioned officer, when I was a young lieutenant, said to me, words that have stuck with me to this day: ignore your soldiers and they'll go away. And I would submit the same is true in the corporate world, where if you ignore your employees, they're going to go away. We've seen a huge migration out of different organizations during the Great Resignation, but how many of those people who left actually felt that they belonged to the culture and were part of the organization? And as you get to know your people, you get to know what inspires them, whether it's an educational opportunity, a different job, a location, additional money, whatever it is that motivates them. And it could be a family issue. And once you know that and they become part of your family, extended family, you're more likely to keep them on board. And when they do leave, you want them to leave with very positive thoughts about your organization. So in the future, they can help maybe refer other employees to you, maybe bring other businesses in. Within the Army, we call it Soldier for Life. We had a couple years back, we were doing some marketing research on ourselves, and we found the population that was least likely to recommend the Army to somebody they influence, a teacher to a student, a parent to a child, an uncle or aunt, were veterans. And so we looked at ourselves really hard in the mirror and said, hey, how'd this happen? And what it was is we weren't treating our soldiers as they were leaving the uniform properly. We saw them as a soldier one day and the next day as a civilian. There's no connective tissue to bring them together. So we worked really hard to get after that, to make sure that when they left with a sense of pride, a sense of belonging, and a sense that they had made a difference in what they did, and keeping in touch with them as they leave in the future to make sure that they know they are still valued members of the community.
I think some of the things that Tom brings up and some of the things that I experienced inside the Navy was what you really got to do is look at what would make them stay. And it needs to be not point to point, one leader to one employee or one other manager. What it needs to be is a system by which guides all leaders to provide fair and equal opportunity and experience for everybody. One of the things that's interesting in our work with our analytics, the term operational objectivity. And what that is it's about the employees and do they see the processes and procedures inside the organization as fair. So when you start to look at why they would leave, it's easy to look at why they would leave and try and prevent those things or make those things better, make it worth the pain. That is important. But then there's another piece where there's symmetry across your organization in terms of what people experience that makes it fair, makes it predictable, makes them understand what to expect. It's the way by which organizations can meet their people's expectations. So I think that's a really important point.
Absolutely. And I think sharing with them the path and why they're important to the organization. One of the jobs I had while I was in uniform, I was arguably the talent manager for all the general officers. So I had about 550 clients, if you will, all of them who seriously outranked me. And what I would do is sit down there with them at least once a year and talk about what the corporate leadership saw as their way ahead. And I would submit to you that really starts for young soldiers as they come in. A soldier graduating from basic training can look forward at the command sergeant major or the first sergeant in their organization, the top non-commissioned officers, and knows there's a pathway. We actually have a designed career path for each one of those specialties to go from joining the Army up to the most senior ranks. Their path can deviate, it can go have some agility, go left to right, they can do different things, but there is a pathway for them to do that. And I had the same conversations with the general officers. Sometimes they didn't like the conversations because they were hard discussions, but they were honest discussions and letting them know so they could manage their expectations that they were important and there was a future without making a commitment, but they knew that there would be opportunity beyond this job, the next job, or if there were not opportunities, they could get ready for life after the Army, get their family ready, their money ready, their financials ready, all those kind of things, so that when they left, they would leave with a very positive impression of their experience.
The term that the way I started to think about this stuff when I first left the military, what I started to realize was, hey, if it's in there, meaning the military, it's also out here. And so one of the things that I often hear from executives and our clients is to talk about career path. And there's a common complaint outside that career paths aren't clear. They are what an individual makes them, and that's partially true. And then oftentimes I've heard people say, well, in the military there's a very clear path, but you just heard Tom say, well, there is a career path. It can go left, right. Oftentimes it's what you want to make of your career. But I do think what the military has done is thought very thoughtfully about how they take somebody from their first level management job and how they build them from a first line manager to eventually being a functional leader, to then becoming a more general leader or an enterprise leader. And they've very thoughtfully thought about not a particular path, but instead an equation of what makes a good leader 20 years from now. And so it's this combination between becoming a functional expert and getting enterprise understanding. And so we see companies do that a lot with emerging leader programs, and it's very important. But I don't think it necessarily needs to be more deliberate. I just think it needs to be more deliberately thought about. I think it just needs to be coached inside companies so that the entire management team and subject matter experts that might not manage people but instead are important for the expertise they bring, that they can think broadly about their progression inside a company, that they can see not necessarily a path but a cardinal direction toward where they want to go.
I think a big part of talent management is not only knowing your employees, but also having the data so you can be informed on what their past experiences is. So from the day a soldier or officer raises their right hand and take an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, we start gathering information on them, and we put that information to use in terms of background opportunities. Do they have an adaptability and an innate ability to speak different languages? Do they have a mechanical approach to what they do to try and get them to where they can be the best version of themselves? We also give people the opportunity to self-declare. So there's some things that aren't anywhere in somebody's records. So for example, if an officer grew up in Indonesia because their parents were missionary or a State Department, that's nowhere in their records. But as you're trying to figure out how to apply their best skills, understanding and having that access to that data and having a conversation with the employee and saying, hey, based on what you've done in the past, here's a great opportunity that fits in your skill set, or here's an opportunity that's not in your skill set, but would give you the opportunity to be broadened and create and open future opportunities.
One of the things that I often see with leaders inside industry is that they expect, and they should expect, but they expect that a one-on-one conversation and coaching and mentorship will be enough. What I hope that you've taken from the conversation with Tom and I regarding these topics is that there is a program in which subordinate leaders can nest within and leverage for the point of retention and preventing attrition.
And some of the things that you have to do as a company are not always easy. In some cases, downsize, and we had to downsize the Army while I was in uniform. In fact, I've grown the Army and I've downsized it, and growing it's a lot more fun. But when you downsize an Army, you have to be really deliberate. I had a mentor who I was talking to about the job I was going to go to where I would be responsible for downsizing the Army. And he said, Tom, look at it this way. He said, if you do it right, you'll have a better Army on the backside of the drawdown. And he said, if you don't do it right, it'll take generations to fix. So with a little bit of pressure, we took a very deliberate approach to it because we realized with decisions we were making, we were going to alter people's lives. And that's something the corporate world has to do every day as you look at your bottom line. What can you afford? What can't you afford? What's the best way to spend your dollars to get to your ultimate objectives across the corporation?